Duke of Blackthorne Manor had not smiled in 7 years. Not when Parliament honoured him. Not when orphanages named wings after him. Not when London newspapers called him the most powerful man in England. And certainly not when society mothers paraded their daughters before him. 7 years earlier, Cyprus Lockwood had buried the woman he loved. Since then, he had buried himself with her. The manor became a monument to grief. The servants whispered. The fireplaces burned cold. The music room remained locked. No laughter existed within its walls. Then one snowy evening a carriage appeared through a blizzard. Inside sat a woman carrying medical supplies, a battered suitcase, and nowhere left to go. Humanitarian nurse Madeline Ellington had just returned from a relief mission overseas. A misunderstanding involving a charitable invitation brought her to Blackthorne Manor. Cyprus intended to send her away immediately. Instead, she stepped from the carriage, slipped on the frozen stone, tumbled directly into the Duke's arms, then accidentally knocked him into a snowbank. The servants froze. The coachman gasped, and for the first time in 7 years, Cyprus Lockwood laughed. Everything changed. Before we continue, I have one quick question for you. Do you think the Duke should open his heart again, or should he protect himself from love forever? Drop your answer in the comments. I really want to know what you think. And please, if this story has pulled you in, help me reach 1,000 subscribers by hitting the subscribe button. Your support tells me you want more emotional stories like this. Thank you. Now let's continue. Chapter 1. Blackthorne Manor rose from the Yorkshire moors like a declaration. 3 stories of grey limestone, its facade darkened by decades of northern weather, its towers visible from any direction for miles across the flat, wind-swept land. It had been built in an age of deliberate grandeur. Every arch calculated, every column chosen to communicate permanence, authority, and the particular message that the Lockwood family had been here before you were born, and intended to be here long after you were gone. In its prime, it had been the kind of house that people travelled to see. Not merely to visit, but to see. The legendary gardens. The ballroom with its painted ceiling. The gallery of portraits stretching back 4 generations. Each Lockwood Duke staring out from his canvas with the same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, the same expression that suggested they had considered lesser men and found them wanting. Now, in December of 1887, it looked like a house in mourning. The gardens were overgrown and white with snow, untended since the last head gardener had quietly left 2 years prior without replacement. The shutters on the upper east wing were closed, and had been for so long that the hinges were rusted in position. The painted ceiling of the ballroom, Cyprus knew without going to check, had developed a fine crack along the north wall that the housekeeper had mentioned twice, and he had not yet arranged to have repaired. He had not, if he was honest with himself, arranged much of anything in some time. He stood now in the entrance hall, having returned from the snowbank with as much dignity as he could assemble, watching Mrs. Warren escort the uninvited guest toward the fire. He had not invited her in. He had simply not yet successfully sent her out. Partly because the blizzard had thickened to the point where returning her to the road would be unconscionable, and partly because Sebastian had appeared. His younger brother, Sebastian Lockwood, was 28 years old and constitutionally incapable of standing by while someone was turned out into a snowstorm. "She stays," Sebastian had said, in that cheerful, unmovable way he had, before Cyprus had managed to form a complete sentence. "The roads are impassable. It would be barbaric." "This is my house," Cyprus had said. Technically, yes, Sebastian had agreed, completely untroubled by this. Cyprus had looked at the blizzard. He had looked at the woman, who was brushing snow from her coat, with the matter-of-fact air of someone accustomed to worse inconveniences than tumbling into snowbanks with dukes. He had looked back at the blizzard. Then he had said nothing and walked inside, which Sebastian had apparently decided to interpret as consent. Now, in the entrance hall, Cyprus watched Mrs. Warren disappear with the guest toward the drawing-room fire and turned to find Sebastian grinning at him from the foot of the stairs. "Not one word," Cyprus said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Sebastian said, in the tone of someone who had a great many words ready and waiting. "The road's clear tomorrow. She leaves tomorrow." "Of course," Sebastian said. "Cyprus, you laughed." The word landed in the hall like a stone dropped in still water. Cyprus said nothing. He turned and walked toward his study. "You laughed," Sebastian said again, quieter now, all the amusement gone. "Do you know how long it has been since?" "Good night, Sebastian." The study door closed. Inside, Cyprus stood behind his desk without sitting. The fire burned low in the grate. On the desk, correspondence sat in neat stacks. Letters from charitable foundations, reports from estate managers, a draft proposal for a new hospital wing in Leeds that required his signature. He picked up his pen. He looked at the correspondence. He set the pen down. He stood very still and listened to the distant sound of voices in the drawing-room. His housekeeper's low, reassuring tones, and beneath it a woman's voice, warmer, asking questions about the staff, with the easy, genuine interest of someone who actually wanted to know. He stood there for longer than he intended. Then he pulled the lamp closer, picked up the pen again, and did not think about the laugh. He did not think about it at all. The guest's name, Mrs. Warren informed him at breakfast the next morning, was Miss Madeline Ellington, and she had shown up in Cyprus's charitable records twice. Once as a relief worker during the northern floods of 1884, and once as the supervising nurse during an outbreak in a village the foundation had assisted in 1885. "She has done considerable work," Mrs. Warren said carefully, setting the morning correspondence beside his plate. "She is here under a misunderstanding," Cyprus said, not looking up from the estate reports. "The roads, Your Grace, are still completely impassable." He looked up. Outside the tall breakfast room windows, the world was entirely white. The drive had vanished. The distant stone walls marking the edge of the property had vanished. Even the large oak at the far end of the garden, a tree so ancient it appeared in the manor's original survey drawings, had been reduced to a dark smudge behind a curtain of falling snow. He looked at this for a moment. "She stays until the road's clear," he said, and returned to the estate reports. "Mrs." Warren said, "Yes, Your Grace," in the particular tone that meant she was relieved and was choosing not to show it. He did not hear the guest until mid-morning, when a sound he had not heard in a long time drifted down from the upper corridor. A kind of purposeful activity. The sound of someone doing things. He heard the young footman Edwin laughing quietly at something, then quickly suppressing it. He heard curtains moving, the particular rattle of rings on an old rod. Cyprus set down his correspondence and walked to the corridor. At the far end, morning light was flooding in through windows that had not been opened in months. Madeline Ellington stood with her back to him, pushing the heavy drapes aside and letting the white winter light pour across the stone floor. She had changed into a sensible, dark dress with practical sleeves and was speaking to Edwin in a low, easy voice that carried no trace of the formal register most visitors adopted in this house. "The ventilation in this corridor is the issue," she was saying, turning to look at the ceiling with a professional assessment that seemed entirely divorced from the decorative aspects of the manor. "If it is damp, it will affect the walls. Has there been any visible mold in the east rooms?" Edwin glanced up and saw Cyprus. His spine immediately straightened. Madeline turned and saw him a beat later. She did not stiffen. She met his gaze with the same directness she had apparently shown when she had knocked him into a snowbank the evening before. "Your Grace," she said, "I hope I have not overstepped. The light in this corridors seemed important for the condition of the walls. I have some experience with damp in enclosed spaces. Cyprus looked at the light streaming in. It caught dust motes in the air, hundreds of tiny bright particles drifting slowly, illuminating the corridor in a way that made it look, briefly, less like a house in mourning. "You may return to your room," he said to Edwin. Then, to Madeline, "I will show you where you may and may not go." She nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable, and waited. He showed her the guest wing, the morning room, the library, the ground parlor, and the kitchen corridor. He did not show her the east wing. He did not mention the music room. She asked only one question during the tour, and it was not the question he expected. "How many staff do you have?" she asked, looking at the size of the entrance hall with an expression that was doing quiet mathematics. "A reduced household, 12. She looked at the hall again, at its vast, cold expanse, its unlit candelabras, its furniture still draped in protective cloths at the far end that had simply never been removed. She said nothing, but something moved across her face. Not pity, he was relieved to note. Something more careful than that, more specific. He recognized it, after a moment, as the look of a person who had walked into many struggling situations and was quietly calculating where help was most needed. He did not know what to do with that. "That will be all," he said. She said, "Thank you," and walked toward the library. And he stood in the entrance hall with the unfamiliar morning light still moving across the floor, and tried to remember what he had been doing before he'd gone to the corridor. He could not, for the life of him, remember. By the second day, 3 things had happened that Cyprus found quietly remarkable. The first was that 2 of the village families, whose children had developed winter fever, had been tended to by Madeline Ellington, who had apparently asked Mrs. Warren about the condition of the nearest village, and then, armed with her medical case, walked the half-mile through clearing snow to see to them personally. She had returned without mentioning it to Cyprus at all. The second was that the kitchen staff were, for reasons he could not entirely account for, laughing again. He heard it from the corridor. That specific sound, the quick, helpless laughter of people who had been given permission to find something funny. The third was that she had organized his charitable correspondence. Not refiled it, not moved it. She had, apparently, noticed the pile in the morning room where Sebastian had been working, realized it was sorted by date rather than urgency, and rearranged it in a manner that left the 3 most pressing items: a hospital funding request, an appeal from a relief mission, and a letter from a physician regarding the Leeds wing. On top, clearly marked, with a handwritten note attached that said simply, "These require immediate attention." Cyprus stood looking at this arrangement for a long time. Then he looked up at Mrs. Warren, who was watching him from the doorway, with an expression of careful neutrality that did not quite conceal her pleasure. "She has a talent," he said flatly. "She does, Your Grace. It is not an invitation to stay." "Of course not, Your Grace." He signed the 3 pressing letters before dinner. At dinner, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, the table was not entirely silent. Sebastian sat across from Madeline and asked her about the relief mission, and she answered with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had long since understood that softening difficult realities helped no one. She spoke about supply shortages, with the same even tone one might use discussing the weather. She described losing a patient in terms so specific and honest that Sebastian fell quiet. And then she moved on, without dwelling, to the part where 3 other patients had recovered against all expectation. And she described this with a warmth that was entirely unsentimental, and all the more genuine for it. Cyprus sat at the head of the table and said very little, but he listened. He noticed somewhere in the middle of the meal that he had finished his food for the first time in weeks, without being reminded to eat by Mrs. Warren's pointed glances, He did not mention this. After dinner, he returned to his study. He sat at his desk. He picked up the pen, and then set it down again, and stared at the fire for a while in a way that was not productive, and was not the kind of thinking that could be described as grief. Precisely. It was more like an echo. Something had vibrated, at dinner, at a frequency he had not felt in a long time. He picked the pen back up, opened the ledger, and told himself firmly that it was nothing. Chapter 2. The roads did not clear the next day, or the day after. The blizzard that had delivered Madeline Ellington to Blackthorne Manor seemed, in Cyprus's darker moments, to have been arranged with specific malicious intent, because it sat over Yorkshire for 4 days without letting up. And by the time the snow finally stopped and the world went quiet, the drifts against the lower gates were 6 feet deep, and no carriage was going anywhere until the roads had been cleared by the village men, which would take at least 3 more days. 9 days total in the end. 9 days during which Cyprus Lockwood attempted, with diminishing success, to maintain the emotional distance that had served him faithfully for 7 years. On the 3rd morning he found Madeline in the library. This was not, in itself, unusual. He had told her she might use the library. What was unusual was that she had pulled the curtains on all 4 windows open to their fullest extent, had lit every lamp available, and was sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a medical text in her lap and a cup of tea balanced on the sill beside her, looking entirely at home in a room that had not looked like anyone was home in it for years. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "There are better chairs," he said, looking at the window seat. "There are," she agreed, "but the light is best here. Your collection is extraordinary, by the way. You have 2 texts here I have been trying to locate for 2 years. I hope you don't mind. I would very much like to copy some sections." He looked at the shelves, at the medical texts he had accumulated, the volumes on charitable practice, the histories of the foundations he funded. He had never quite examined the collection from the outside before. "Copy what you need," he said. She thanked him with a small, genuine smile and returned to her book. He had come in to find a specific estate document. He found it eventually, after somewhat more searching than usual. Then he sat at the reading table, not at the window seat, a good distance away, and began going through the document. An hour passed before either of them spoke again. "Why do you never attend in person?" she asked. He looked up. She was not looking at him. She was still reading, her finger tracing a line in the medical text, but her question had been clear and direct. "I beg your pardon, your foundation. You fund a great deal, but I have attended 4 of its supported operations, and you have never been present at any of them. Not one visit, not one inspection. You correspond extensively, you direct funds with real precision, you clearly understand the work." She looked up now. "But you never come." Cyprus studied her for a moment. There was no accusation in the question. It was simply a question. The kind a person asked when they genuinely wanted to understand something, rather than when they wanted to demonstrate that they had noticed something uncomfortable. "The work speaks for itself," he said. She nodded slowly, not accepting this but not pressing it either, and returned to her text. He looked back at his document. The words blurred slightly. The honest answer, the answer he would not give, was that attending in person required a quality of presence he had not trusted himself to maintain. Grief had not made him cold to other people's suffering. It had made him, if anything, too susceptible to it. In the early years after Evangeline's death, he had found that encountering real human pain face to face undid something in him that took days to reassemble. Distance was efficient. Distance protected the work from his own instability. But he had told himself it was about professionalism, and after enough years, he had nearly believed it. He did not say any of this. He folded the estate document and left the library. By the fourth day, the servants were transformed. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that happened in increments. The way a room warms slowly, and you don't notice until you look back and realize the cold is gone. Mrs. Warren moved through the house with a lightness that Cyprus had not seen in her for years. Edwin had started whistling, quietly, in the back corridors, stopping whenever he thought Cyprus might be nearby, but not always calculating correctly, so fragments of tuneless melody floated through doorways at unexpected moments. The kitchen was the most altered. Madeline had spent an afternoon in there, officially asking the cook about the village's food supply situation, but apparently remaining for considerably longer than strictly necessary, and whatever had been discussed had resulted in the first properly elaborate dinner Cyprus had been served in 18 months, not merely edible, considered. The kind of meal that suggested someone in the kitchen had remembered they were good at this. He did not comment on it at dinner, but after Sebastian had retired, and the table was cleared, and Cyprus sat alone with his brandy, he found himself, for the first time since he could recall, in no particular hurry to go to bed. He sat with the fire and the silence, and tried to determine what exactly had changed. The house felt different. There was no logical basis for this. 9 days of a stranger's presence should not alter the texture of a building, and yet there was something in the air that had not been there before. A faint sense of occupancy, of warmth that extended beyond the fireplaces, of a house that had been, however briefly, reminded of its original purpose. Blackthorne Manor had been built to be a home. It had not been one in a very long time. He took a longer drink of brandy than usual, and told himself this was sentimental, which it was, and that it was meaningless, which it was not, and went to bed. On the 5th evening, the first dinner conversation of any real consequence occurred. It started because of Sebastian, who had developed a habit of asking Madeline questions at the table that were specifically designed to elicit the kind of answers that required Cyprus to pay attention. This was transparent but effective. "What draws a person to relief work?" Sebastian asked. "Originally, I mean. Most people of good will donate. They don't go." Madeline was quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved across her face. She was not classically beautiful, in the way that London society understood beauty. But there was something in her features that compelled attention, in the way that honesty sometimes did, an openness. A quality of being entirely present that was, Cyprus found, increasingly difficult to look away from. "My mother was a parish nurse," she said, "in a very poor part of Bristol. She believed, with great conviction, that compassion was not a feeling. It was a practice. You practiced it the way you practiced a skill. You went to where it was needed, and you did the work." She paused. "I went on my first mission at 21. I discovered she was right." "Was it frightening?" Sebastian asked. "Constantly." She smiled, a small private thing. "But fright is just information. It tells you the stakes are real. I find I trust situations more when I am a little afraid." Cyprus looked up from his plate. She caught his gaze. He looked away first. Later, returning to his study, he stood at the window and looked out at the snow-covered grounds and thought about the phrase, "Fright is just information," and the complete absence of any performance in the way she had said it. Evangeline had been fearless in a different way, a bright, laughing fearlessness, the kind that came from a nature that simply did not anticipate difficulty. It had been one of the things he had loved most in her, and when the difficulty had come, it had come so suddenly and so completely that the brightness had simply gone out, and he had not been there, and he had been too late, and he pressed the thought down with the practiced firmness of 7 years' repetition, but it took longer than usual. On the 6th evening, the verbal sparring began. It had been building, Cyprus recognized in retrospect, through the incremental accumulation of small moments. The library, the correspondence, the dinners. It had been building because Madeline Ellington, unlike every other visitor Blackthorne Manor had received in 7 years, did not treat him as though he were made of something fragile or dangerous. She treated him with breathtaking normality, as though he were simply a person. "You disagree with my foundation's distribution model," he said, setting down his fork at dinner. Madeline looked at him with an expression of mild surprise. "I do, yes. You've read the last 3 annual reports. They were in the library, they were in the estate documents section. I read widely when I'm confined indoors by snow." She met his gaze steadily. "The model prioritizes institutional partnerships. I understand why. It's efficient, it's auditable, it scales. But institutions often have the least access to the people who need the most help. Individual practitioners on the ground can reach places that a formal supply chain cannot." "Individual practitioners are difficult to audit," Cyprus said. "They are difficult to hold accountable. The history of charitable fraud is real and significant," she said. "I know. But the solution to fraud risk is not to fund only organizations too large to be dishonest. It is to build better accountability mechanisms for smaller providers." Sebastian was looking between them with undisguised enjoyment. Cyprus said more slowly, "And you have a proposal for such a mechanism?" She blinked. She had not, apparently, expected that response. "Not a formalized one," she said. "Then I suggest you draft one," he said. "There is paper in the library." Or a pause. "I will," she said. He picked up his fork. Sebastian hid his expression behind his wineglass. Cyprus found, after dinner, that he was not going to his study to be alone with his thoughts. He was going to his study to think about supply chains and accountability mechanisms, and this was an entirely different and infinitely more manageable activity. He told himself this was why he sat at his desk until midnight and found it unexpectedly easy to remain awake. Chapter 3. It was on the 7th day that Madeline found the music room. She had not been looking for it. She had been exploring the library's upper gallery, where the estate maps were kept, following up a thought about the village infrastructure that had occurred to her in the night. The upper gallery had a door at its east end that she had assumed was a storage room. It opened onto a corridor she had not seen before, and at the end of that corridor was another door, and that door was locked, but the key was in the lock. She stood before it for a moment. The key was large and old, and someone had left it there with the particular quality of something that had not been moved in a long time, but had not been removed either. As though whoever had locked the door could not decide between sealed and gone. She did not open it. She went back to the library and found Mrs. Warren and asked, quietly, about the locked room. Mrs. Warren was quiet for a long time. "The music room," she said at last. "Her Grace's piano is in there. She played every day. It has not been opened since." She paused. "Since she passed." Madeline looked at the key in her own hand. She had, without thinking, brought it with her. She handed it back to Mrs. Warren. "Thank you," she said simply. That evening, Cyprus could not sleep. He had retired at his usual hour, but somewhere near midnight, he found himself standing in the corridor outside his own bedroom, in the dark, entirely awake, listening to something, music. It was faint, coming from 2 floors below, muffled through the walls and floors of the large house. He stood completely still and listened. A pianoforte. Someone was playing the pianoforte. The piece was not Evangeline's. He knew every note she had ever played, had catalogued them in the years since her death, with the terrible precision of a man determined to preserve every trace. This piece was different, slower, more tentative in places, as though the player was working through it from memory, finding it as they went. He walked. The music room door was open. A single candelabra burned on the side table. Madeline sat at the piano with her back to the door, and she was playing with the careful concentration of someone who had not played in some time, but had not forgotten. The way the body remembers things, the mind thinks it has lost. Cyprus stood in the doorway. He had not been in this room in 7 years. He had walked past the door 10,000 times, and never come within 6 feet of it. And now he was standing in the doorway, and the room was full of candlelight, and the smell of roses that still drifted faintly from the dried arrangement on the mantelpiece. And Evangeline's piano was alive again. Something tore open in his chest. It was not pain exactly, it was not grief exactly. It was something older and more complex. The specific sensation of something that had been clenched for so long it had forgotten it could release. Madeline reached the end of the piece and let her hands rest on the keys. She had known, Cyprus realized, that he was there. She did not turn around. She sat quietly. "Mrs. Warren told me the room was sealed," she said. "But she also told me it should not have been, not forever. I hope I have not caused harm." He did not speak for a moment. He was not certain he could. "She played beautifully," he said at last. His voice came out different than usual, lower, less controlled. "So I am told." A pause. "Would you tell me about her?" No one asked him about Evangeline. People carefully avoided the subject. They treated her the way one treats a wound, by not looking at it directly, by talking around it, by hoping that if they were sufficiently tactful, the whole subject would recede. Cyprus walked into the room. He sat in the chair beside the piano, the chair where he had always sat when she played, and he looked at the keys, and after a moment he began to talk. Not everything, not the full inventory of a 7-year grief, but some of it, the way she had played with complete unself-consciousness. As though the music were a second language, she spoke more fluently than English. The way she had laughed, which had been entirely undignified for a duchess, and entirely perfect. The way she had believed, with quiet firmness, that his title was something he wore, and not something he was, and that this distinction mattered. Madeline listened without filling the silences. She asked one question at the right moment. "Were you happy?" He considered this with more seriousness than the question was perhaps designed to require. "Yes," he said, "completely, without reservation." "That is not a small thing," she said. "No." He looked at the keys. "It is not." A long quiet. The candles moved. Something in the air between them settled, like a room coming to the right temperature. "What brought you to nursing?" he asked. She told him about her mother. She told him about Bristol, about growing up in the close, crowded streets near the docks, watching her mother work with no tools but her hands and her knowledge, and the dogged refusal to accept that proximity to suffering was the same as helplessness. She told him about the first mission, and the fear, and the way it had resolved into something that felt, if not like peace, then at least like purpose. And then she told him about the last mission. Not the clinical report version she had given Sebastian at dinner, the real version. The part where she had sat in a supply tent with no medicines left, and 3 patients who needed them and had understood, for the first time, what her mother must have felt every day of her working life. That helplessness was the same whether it belonged to a duchess or a dockworker's daughter. And that loving people was the specific vulnerability that made it unbearable. Cyprus looked at her. She was not performing this. She was not angling it toward any particular conclusion. She was simply telling him the truth, the way people do at midnight in candlelit rooms when the ordinary barriers have temporarily come down. He found that his hand was resting on the edge of the piano, and that her hand was resting a few inches from his on the same surface, and that this proximity had arrived without either of them arranging it. He became aware of it at the same time she did, the slight stillness in both of them. He moved his hand. She returned her attention to the keys. "I should let you sleep," he said, standing. "Of course." She looked up, and her expression was composed, but there was something in it, a particular quality of steadiness that looked like it was maintaining itself against something. He walked to the door. "Cyprus," she said. He stopped. She had not used his name before. He had not given it. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me play it." He stood in the doorway with his back to the room for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for playing." He walked back to his room. He did not sleep for a very long time, but it was not the familiar sleeplessness of grief. It was something else entirely. 3 evenings later, the roads cleared, and then it snowed again. This time, Cyprus did not mention it to Mrs. Warren. He did not send for the road report. He sat at his desk and signed the hospital wing proposal for Leeds and sent it to the appropriate parties. And he did not calculate how many more days it might take for the drive to be passable. He told himself this was not significant. Sebastian, passing his study door, stopped and looked in with an expression of extraordinary satisfaction. "Not one word," Cyprus said without looking up. Sebastian walked on. In the library that afternoon, Cyprus found Madeline at the reading table with 3 sheets of paper covered in her neat, compact handwriting, the outline of an accountability framework for independent charitable practitioners. He read it without asking permission and found it thoughtful, precise, and practically achievable. He sat across from her without invitation and read it a second time. "The oversight committee structure is underdeveloped," he said. "I know," she said. "I was hoping someone with relevant institutional knowledge might have thoughts on that section." He looked up. She was watching him with a small, careful smile. He pulled the sheets toward him, reached past her for a pen, and began making notes in the margin. The afternoon passed. The fire burned. The light shifted from pale gold to amber. Neither of them noticed when it grew dark. Chapter 4. The peace broke on the 12th day. It broke because a carriage appeared on the cleared drive on a Wednesday morning carrying 2 passengers. Lord Dorian Vaughan, who was Madeline's former employer, and Lady Vivienne Carrington, who had been informally positioned by her mother and London society as the most probable second Duchess of Blackthorne. Cyprus received them in the formal drawing-room, with the particular blank courtesy that had served as his social face for 7 years. Lord Vaughan was 52, impeccably dressed, with the kind of easy confidence that came from decades of being the most important person in every room he entered. He had run a prestigious charitable foundation for 15 years, and in that time had built a reputation that was, like most things built principally on reputation, somewhat ahead of the actual substance. "Lockwood," Vaughan said, accepting brandy with the familiarity of someone who considered himself a peer. "I heard your roads had cleared. I came to discuss the spring endowments." A pause. "I also heard you had a guest." The way he said guest contained several things Cyprus immediately disliked. "I have several members of staff," Cyprus said evenly, "and my brother is in residence." "I mean the nurse," Vaughan said. "Ellington. I heard she had turned up." He set his glass down. "I want to offer you some counsel as a fellow supporter of charitable causes, Lockwood. The woman has a history of this." Cyprus was quiet for a moment. "A history of what?" he said. "Presenting herself to men of influence. Making herself indispensable. There was an incident in Whitby. A widower, considerable estate. She was there for 3 months before he thought better of it." Vaughan picked up his glass again. "I'm certain her intentions are perfectly fine. But in terms of appearances—" "Her intentions," Cyprus said, with a quietness that had a different quality than his ordinary quiet, "are to provide medical care to the people who need it, which is what she has done, including to several families in my own village, in the time she has been here." Vaughan smiled. "Of course, I'm not suggesting otherwise." But he had suggested precisely that, and both men knew it, and Cyprus's expression communicated this without any particular elaboration. In the adjoining room, Lady Vivienne was speaking with Sebastian. and from the corridor Cyprus could hear her voice. Light, polished, doing the particular work of a woman who had been trained since childhood to perform pleasant conversation as a form of social occupation. She was 23, very beautiful, and in possession of an ambition that she kept carefully wrapped in the appearance of indifference. She had, Cyprus knew, been pursuing the question of the Blackthorne dukedom with the focused patience of a long-term investment strategy. He had not encouraged it. He had also not, in fairness, actively discouraged it, because doing so required engaging with the subject in a direct way he had been avoiding for several years. He dealt with Vaughan's visit with efficient courtesy and showed him out within the hour. But Vaughan had planted something, and in the days that followed, Cyprus felt it working. The weather turned mild, the ground softened. Madeline should have left. She did not leave, because Sebastian had mentioned to Mrs. Warren that the village families she had been treating still required follow-up visits, and Mrs. Warren had mentioned this to Madeline, and Madeline, being exactly the person she was, had simply stayed. Cyprus knew he should say something. Instead, he said nothing, and watched himself not saying it with the uncomfortable clarity of a man watching himself do something he has already decided he will regret. The doubt had arrived after Vaughan's visit, and it had the particular quality of all doubt planted by a malicious source. It was not convincing, precisely, but it was disruptive. It inserted itself between Cyprus and the ease he had been, cautiously beginning to feel. She makes herself indispensable. He watched her, now, with a different quality of attention. He watched how she drew the staff's warmth, how she asked questions that made people feel their answers mattered, how she had arranged, without appearing to arrange anything, to become woven into the daily texture of Blackthorne Manor. Was it deliberate? He found he could not tell, and the fact that he could not tell frightened him more than either answer. He withdrew, not dramatically, not completely, but he stopped seeking her out in the library. He ate dinner without contributing to conversation. He let Sebastian carry the evenings. On the third day, Madeline noticed. He knew she noticed because she said nothing about it, and because the particular quality of her silence had changed from the easy, companionable quiet they had built over the previous days to something more careful, more contained. On the fourth day it rained, a hard, driving rain that arrived without warning during an afternoon walk Madeline had taken toward the village. Cyprus was riding back from the east fields when he saw her, a dark figure moving through the rain without shelter, carrying her medical case, soaked through. He turned his horse. They took cover in the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the south wood. A small stone structure, long unused, with a sound roof and a stack of dry wood beside the cold fireplace. Cyprus built the fire. Madeline sat on the low bench near the wall and wrung water from her sleeve with the practical calm of someone who had been wet in worse circumstances. The rain hammered the roof. The fire caught. The silence in the cottage was very different from the silence they had built in the library. "You have been avoiding me," she said. He looked at the fire. "I have been occupied." "You have been occupied, and you have been avoiding me." He said nothing. "Lord Vaughan said something," she said. It was not a question. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that steady, clear attention, not hurt, not angry, present, waiting. "He mentioned a widower in Whitby," Cyprus said. The silence stretched for a long moment. "I see." She looked at the fire. Something moved through her expression and was mastered. "What did he tell you?" "That you had been present at an estate for 3 months before the gentleman thought better of the situation." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What he did not tell you is that the gentleman in question was Lord Vaughan's own cousin, or that Vaughan had directed me to that estate specifically to provide nursing care to the cousin's ailing mother, who recovered, or that the cousin developed an attachment I had not encouraged, and when I made clear it was not welcome, Vaughan decided I had behaved improperly." She looked at Cyprus. The version of that story varies depending on what Dorian Vaughan wants from the listener. Cyprus looked at her for a long time. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said immediately. "You have known me for 12 days. He has known you for 15 years. You were right to consider what he said." "I was wrong to." He stopped. He was not certain how to complete the sentence without saying more than he intended. "I was wrong to let it matter as much as it did. Because I had already begun to care about your opinion, and when I thought I might have been foolish to care, it was easier to pull away than to admit the caring existed." He did not say this, but the fire burned between them and the rain was loud on the roof, and the space in the cottage was small enough that the unsaid thing existed in it as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. "Madeline," he said. She looked at him. "I think—" He stopped. "It is too soon." The thought arrived with such force that he could not speak past it. "You loved Evangeline. You buried her. What you are feeling is— You do not know what you are feeling. It has been 12 days. I think the rain is easing," he said. Something passed over her face. It was, he thought, disappointment, controlled instantly, perfectly, with the skill of a person who had spent years not allowing their own needs to complicate difficult situations. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." They walked back to the manor in near silence, a careful distance between them. That night, lying in the dark, Cyprus Lockwood thought, "I am afraid." And for the first time in 7 years, the thing he was afraid of was not grief. Chapter 5. The winter charity ball had been a Lockwood tradition for 40 years. It had not been held for 7. It was Sebastian who proposed it, 3 days after the rainstorm, with a kind of careful casualness that Cyprus had learned to recognize as the outer coating of an extremely deliberate plan. "The tenants expect it," Sebastian said. "The village has been asking. The foundation could announce the Leeds hospital wing. It would be an appropriate occasion." Cyprus looked at his brother for a long time. "You want me to host a ball," he said. "The manor is in good enough repair. The staff is." Sebastian paused delicately, reinvigorated. "This is not about the Leeds announcement." Sebastian met his gaze steadily. "It is partly about the Leeds announcement." Cyprus set down his pen. He looked at the window. He looked at the estate ledger. He thought about Madeline, who had said nothing about leaving, and to whom he had been saying nothing of significance for 4 days, and about the way the manor felt now versus the way it had felt on the evening before her carriage appeared through the blizzard. "Arrange it," he said. Sebastian left before Cyprus could change his mind. Madeline heard about the ball from Mrs. Warren, who was quietly, transparently delighted. She was sitting in the library reading Madeline's accountability framework, which Cyprus had apparently reviewed, annotated, and added 3 additional pages to, when Mrs. Warren appeared in the doorway. "His Grace has announced the winter ball is to be reinstated," Mrs. Warren said, "for next Saturday. It will be the first in 7 years." Madeline set the framework down. She thought about what it had taken for Cyprus to say that word. She thought about the music room, and the fire, and the rain in the cottage, and the sentence he had not finished. "That is wonderful," she said genuinely. "There will be guests," Mrs. Warren said, and her voice shifted slightly. "From London. Lady Carrington will likely attend." Madeline looked at her. "Lady Carrington is— She has been persistent," Mrs. Warren said, with the particular restraint of a woman who had strong opinions about this, and was exercising significant discipline, "for some years now." Madeline absorbed this. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Warren." The housekeeper nodded and left. Madeline sat with the annotated framework in her lap and looked at Cyprus's handwriting in the margins, precise, slightly angular, cramped, in the way of someone who has a great deal to say and is accustomed to limiting space. In the section on individual practitioner accountability, he had written. This approach requires a level of trust in individual judgment that is difficult to institutionalize. I believe it is nonetheless correct. She read this twice, then she set the framework aside and looked out the window at the east garden. Wild, untended, snow-covered. Somewhere beneath the snow, Evangeline's roses. She thought about what it was to love someone so much that your grief became your loyalty, that releasing it felt like betrayal. She thought about the sentence he had not finished, and she thought, very clearly, if he cannot choose himself, I cannot choose him for him, and I should not stay here and make it harder. She went to tell Mrs. Warren she would need assistance with a dress. The house transformed in the 3 days before the ball. Cyprus watched it happen from a controlled distance, directing the preparations with the administrative efficiency he brought to everything, while simultaneously engaging in the most strenuous internal struggle of the previous 7 years. He had been given by Sebastian a set of facts. Madeline was leaving after the ball, her situation in London, a position at a charitable hospital that had been offered during her absence, could not wait indefinitely. The ball was, therefore, in some meaningful sense, the last occasion. He had been given by himself a set of arguments against this framing. He was not certain of what he felt. He had known her for 17 days. He was, at 46, no, 36, a man who had buried one love and had no particular interest in acquiring the emotional vocabulary for another. His life was functional, efficient, without unnecessary complication. These arguments had the quality of very strong arguments that he did not believe. Sebastian appeared in his dressing room on the evening before the ball, while Cyprus was reviewing correspondence with the particular intensity of a man avoiding a different problem. She is leaving Tuesday, Sebastian said. I know. Cyprus. Sebastian sat down, abandoning all performance of casualness. You have been alive in a way you have not been in 7 years. I have watched it. Mrs. Warren has watched it. The entire household has watched it. You know what you feel. Cyprus set down the correspondence. I know what I felt, he said, about Evangeline. I knew exactly what that was. This is, he stopped. Different, Sebastian said. Different. Yes. I don't know if different is, I don't know if it's enough, or appropriate, or if I have the right. The right? Sebastian stared at him. What does the right have to do with any of it? She is 26. I am 36. She has a life, a career, a direction. And you have what? Sebastian said more quietly now. A very large, cold house and a well-funded grief. The silence was sharp. Cyprus looked at the fire. Evangeline would have laughed at this. She would have laughed and then said something that cut directly to the truth of it, because she had always had that gift. The ability to identify exactly where he was hiding and refuse to let him remain there. I think, my love, he thought, that you would have liked her very much. The thought arrived gently, without the usual pain. Something settled in him. The ball is tomorrow, Sebastian said quietly, standing. After that, she's gone. He left Cyprus alone with the fire. Cyprus sat with it for a long time. Chapter 6. The ballroom at Blackthorne Manor had not been open for 7 years, and it showed its readiness with a splendor that silenced every person who walked through its doors. The painted ceiling, repaired at Cyprus's hasty instruction 2 days prior, glowed in the light of 300 candles, its classical figures emerging from the warm gold as though they had only been sleeping and were now politely awake again. The floor had been polished until the candlelight moved across it in double, reflecting the room back at itself in miniature. The orchestra, installed in the gallery, played the opening measures as the first carriages arrived, and the hall filled with the sounds of arrivals, the particular social music of Yorkshire's winter society, gathering for the first time in years. They came, many of them, as much out of curiosity as anything else. The ball had been a legend. The Duke's social re-emergence was significant enough to discuss for weeks in London, and the rumours about a guest at Blackthorne Manor, a nurse, of all things. Some said she was a distant relation. Others said something quite different, had provided exactly the kind of narrative fuel that kept London society in excellent conversational health throughout the winter months. Lady Vivian Carrington arrived in emerald silk, accompanied by her mother and Lord Vaughan, who had apparently decided that if the ball was happening, he preferred to be present for it. Madeline arrived in the ballroom in a dress that Mrs. Warren had pressed and carefully altered. Deep blue, simply cut, entirely free of the elaborate ornamentation that the other women wore. She looked, Cyprus thought from across the room, exactly like herself. Which was the most complete description he had. He watched Vivienne cross to Madeline within the first quarter hour. He could not hear the exchange, but he watched it from 20 feet away. Vivienne's porcelain smile, her measured pleasantries, the particular quality of politeness that contained its own diminishment. He watched Madeline receive it with perfect composure. He watched Vivienne glance toward Cyprus with a small, significant look, as if to confirm the observation she had come to make. Cyprus moved toward them. He was intercepted by Vaughan. "Excellent occasion, Lockwood," Vaughan said, taking up a position beside him. "I'm glad to see the manor returning to its old form." He followed Cyprus's gaze across the room. "She's ambitious, your guest. I hope you are clear-eyed about what brings a woman of her circumstances into a house of this significance." "Lord Vaughan," Cyprus said, looking at him directly, "I have been very clear-eyed about this matter." "Good," Vaughan said. "What I have been clear-eyed about," Cyprus continued, in the same tone, "is that you directed her to your cousin's estate at your convenience, dismissed her when the situation became inconvenient for you, and have spent the years since constructing a version of events that protects your reputation at the cost of hers. I have been considerably clear-eyed about that." Vaughan's expression stilled. "That is a significant accusation," he said. "It is an accurate observation," Cyprus said. "I recommend you confine your charitable advisory to your own affairs this evening." He walked away from Vaughan before the man could collect himself. Across the room, the situation had progressed. Vivienne had been joined by 2 other women, and the group had arranged itself around Madeline with the specific geometry of a social exclusion. Pleasant on the surface, isolating in effect. He could see, from Madeline's expression, that she understood exactly what was happening, and was handling it with the same composed practicality she brought to all difficult situations. And then Vivienne said something that changed Madeline's expression. Cyprus could not hear the words, but he saw the slight flinch, small, controlled, instantly recovered. And he saw what followed it. Madeline setting down her glass, straightening, and beginning the particular movement of someone making a graceful exit from a situation that has become untenable. She was going to leave, not just the group, the ball. He knew this with the certainty of a man who had been watching someone carefully and had learned to read the specific language of their composure. He moved, not toward Madeline, not yet. He moved to the center of the ballroom floor, and he stopped there. And then he turned to face the orchestra gallery and raised one hand. The music stopped. Every conversation in the room stopped with it. 200 people looked at the Duke of Blackthorne standing alone in the center of the ballroom floor. And the room was so quiet that the candle flames were visible, moving in the draught of their collective silence. Cyprus turned to face the room. He did not rehearse this. He did not have anything prepared. He had, in fact, no idea what he was about to say until the moment he said it. "This evening," he said, and his voice carried in the way of men accustomed to addressing large rooms, "we are here to mark the revival of a tradition, and to celebrate the opening of the Lockwood wing at Leeds General Hospital, which will serve approximately 2,000 patients annually. He paused. I wish to take this moment to acknowledge the person whose work has directly informed the operational model for that wing's charitable support structure, and whose presence in this house has reminded all of us what it looks like when someone practices compassion rather than merely performs it. 200 pairs of eyes moved, slowly, to find Madeline. She was very still. Miss Ellington, Cyprus said, arrived here through a series of misunderstandings, stayed through the generosity of a blizzard, and has spent the past fortnight treating my village families, improving my foundation's framework, and tolerating my conversation with a patience I have not deserved. His voice did not waver. She is the most genuinely good person I have encountered in a long time. Any aspersion cast on her character tonight, or at any other time, reflects nothing on her and everything on the person doing the casting. He paused. Vivian Carrington had gone very still. Vaughan had gone a color that suggested he was calculating several things simultaneously. I would rather lose every title I possess, Cyprus said, than lose her opinion of me, and I intend to ensure I deserve it. He turned to look directly at Madeline. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. It was too full, too layered, too much. Her eyes were bright. Her composure was present, but only barely, in the way of something that was holding, because it was very good at holding, and for no other reason. Miss Ellington, he said, extending his hand, would you do me the very great honor of this dance? The silence held for one more moment. Then the orchestra began. She walked toward him. She took his hand. They moved to the center of the floor as the first couples joined them, and the room breathed again, and the candles moved, and the painted ceiling presided over all of it, with the patient, knowing look of a room that had seen a great many things and had been waiting specifically for this. Cyprus held her hand and placed his other hand at her waist, and they danced, and he was aware of nothing else in the room. Not Vaughan, not Vivienne, not Sebastian, watching from the side with an expression that was not quite a grin, because the moment was too large for a grin. That was quite unnecessary, Madeline said quietly, not looking at him. It was entirely necessary, he said. You have made rather a public statement. I meant every word of it. She looked up at him then. Cyprus, she said, and stopped. I know, he said. I know it is. I know there is a great deal I have not said, and a great deal you do not yet know about what the past 7 years have been. I know it may be too much to ask. It isn't, she said, then more quietly. It isn't too much. They danced. The rest of the room continued around them, but it was, in the way of certain specific moments, entirely beside the point. Later, much later, when the last guests had gone and the candles were burning low and the orchestra had packed their instruments and gone, they walked out through the glass doors of the ballroom into the east garden. The snow had melted in the mild air of the last days. The ground was soft, and in the patchy, moonlit dark of the garden, the outline of rose bushes was visible. Overgrown, tangled, but alive. Some of them, he noticed for the first time, were budding. She planted those, he said, not needing to explain who. Madeline looked at the roses. They've been here all this time, she said. Yes. He stood beside her in the garden and looked at the dark shapes of the rose canes against the sky. They have. She did not say anything. She simply stood beside him, close enough that their arms were touching, and looked at the garden that a woman he had loved had planted, and that had kept growing in her absence, quietly, through 7 winters. He took her hand, she let him. They stood in the east garden for a long time, and above them, through the ballroom windows, the last of the candles burned. Chapter 7. The letter was found in February. Cyprus was having Evangeline's writing desk moved from the sealed east bedroom. He had made the decision quietly, in the week after the ball, that the room would be a room again, and the desk would be given to the Foundation's London office, where it would be used by people working toward the causes Evangeline had believed in. This seemed correct. This seemed like something she would have approved of. Mrs. Warren was overseeing the move when one of the footmen found the envelope. It was tucked into the narrow gap between the desk's back panel and its interior shelf, the kind of gap where small things fall and are forgotten, or are placed and not found until the right time. The envelope was sealed. His name was written on it in Evangeline's handwriting. Mrs. Warren brought it to Cyprus in his study. He held it for a long time before he opened it. He had not wept when they buried her. He had not wept in 7 years. Or rather, he had wept in the specific private darkness of a few very difficult nights, and had repaired himself before morning, and had never allowed it in any form that felt like surrender. He wept now, quietly in his study with the letter open in his hands. It was not long. Evangeline had never been long-winded. She had been, in all things, direct and warm and without pretension, and the letter was all of those things. She had written it. He could tell from the paper and the ink, some months before her death. During the illness, when she had known what was coming before she had told him. Cyprus, she had written, I have spent several days debating whether to write this, because I am aware you will find it either too soon or too late, and never quite at the right moment. This is, I think, the nature of such letters. I want to tell you something I have always known about you, which is that you love with your entire self, all the way down to the bone. This is the best thing about you, and it is also the thing I am most worried about, because I know that if I am gone and you are here, you will give your entire self to the grief of it, and call that loyalty. It is not loyalty, it is just pain, Cyprus, and you are allowed to stop. I have not loved you less in the years I have known you. I have not asked you for more than you had to give. I ask you for one thing now, that when the world offers you something that moves you, something true, something honest, something that makes you laugh again, because God knows you need to laugh, you do not turn it away in my name. In my name, I ask you to receive it. I love you completely. I will love you from wherever people go when they leave. Don't be cold, Cyprus. The house was never meant for cold. Evangeline sat with the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and carried it to the music room, where he set it on the closed lid of the piano. He stood there for a while in the afternoon light, which was brighter now than it had been. In December, the winter working its way toward spring, the frost leaving the windows, he said quietly into the room, I heard you. Then he went to find Madeline. She was in the East Garden. Of course she was. She had been coming here every morning since the ball, in the early light before anyone else was up. And he had known this because Mrs. Warren had mentioned it with the careful nonchalance of someone delivering information they knew to be important. She was kneeling in the frozen soil, with her sleeves rolled and her gardening gloves on. She had found gardening gloves somewhere in the manner of a person who finds what she needs, cutting back the deadwood from Evangeline's roses with the focused attention she brought to all practical tasks. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. She read something in his face before he spoke. Something had shifted in him, and it was visible, and she saw it clearly. She sat back on her heels and waited. He crossed the garden and crouched down beside her and looked at the rose canes she had been clearing, at the new green growth appearing at the joints of the old wood. There is a letter, he said, from Evangeline. I found it this morning. He stopped. She told me to stop. Madeline looked at him. To stop grieving. To stop using the grief as a reason not to live. He looked at the roses. I have been doing that for 7 years. I believe I understood this before I found the letter, but she has always had better timing than I have. Madeline was very still. Cyprus, she said. He looked at her. I have been in this house for 6 weeks, she said. I have a position in London I have deferred twice. I have been deferring it because—" She stopped. Her composure was doing that thing it did under pressure, holding because it was very good at holding, and for no other reason. "Because I did not want to go." "Then don't," he said. "That is not—" She shook her head, a small, almost helpless motion. "That is not a plan, Cyprus." "No," he agreed. "It is not a plan." He reached out and took her hand. She was still wearing the gardening glove, which made this, in some way, perfect. "Will you give me the opportunity to make it one?" She looked at him for a long time, and then she laughed. Small and surprised, the way laughter arrives when you have been very serious for a very long time, and something has suddenly given. It was warm and real and entirely undignified, and it was the best sound Cyprus Lockwood had heard since December. "Yes," she said, "I will give you the opportunity." He pressed her gloved hand between both of his and looked at her in the morning light, in the garden where Evangeline's roses were coming back to life, and felt something happen in his chest that had no precise name but was entirely the opposite of the 7-year hollow. It was fullness, just that. The spring arrived at Blackthorne Manor with the specific enthusiasm of a season that had been waiting. The east garden was cleared and replanted under Madeline's direction. The roses pruned properly, new beds laid out, the old stone paths between them swept clean. Mrs. Warren declared, to anyone who would listen, that the east garden was going to be extraordinary this summer, and nobody disagreed with her. The music room was opened every day now. Madeline played in the mornings. Cyprus had discovered, tentatively, that he could sit in the room and work, and find it not only bearable but good. On some evenings he played himself. Badly, haltingly, with a stiffness that Madeline pretended not to notice while clearly noticing it. And she sat beside him on the bench and guided his hands with patient precision. And these evenings were among the best of his recent life. The accountability framework was submitted to the Foundations Board in March and adopted in full. The Leeds Hospital wing opened in April, and Cyprus attended the opening in person, standing in the ward, shaking the hands of the physicians, listening to the patients, present in a way that he had not been in 7 years. It was difficult. It was also, entirely unexpectedly, one of the best days he had experienced in a long time. Madeline stood beside him at the opening, in her professional capacity. She introduced him to 2 patients whose stories were specific and ordinary and devastating in the particular way that real human experience tends to be. And he listened to both of them with his full attention, and he found, to his quiet astonishment, that he could bear it. "Fright is just information," she had said. "I trust situations more when I am a little afraid." He was beginning to understand what she meant. He proposed on to Tuesday. It was not dramatic. There was no ballroom, no grand occasion, no specific arrangement. He had been thinking about it for some weeks, and he had the ring. Evangeline's ring had remained in his possession, and he had, on the advice of a jeweler and his own careful thought, chosen a different stone. Because Madeline was not Evangeline, and should not be asked to wear her ring, and she was herself, and deserved something chosen for her. He found her in the library at mid-afternoon, reading with her feet tucked under her and her hair slightly disordered, and a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her because she had forgotten it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and something settled in him with the finality of something that has been working toward its position for a long time and has now arrived. "Madeline," he said. She looked up. He walked in and sat across from her, and he looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "You told me once that you trust situations more when you are a little afraid." He paused. "I want you to know that I am very afraid. Not of you, of the wanting. Of how much I want this to be right. Of what it would mean if—" He stopped. "I have not been good at this before. I have not practiced it. I am going to make errors." She set her book down slowly. "You are not," she said carefully, "very skilled at the preamble to proposals." Something shifted in his face, the corner of his mouth. "No," he agreed, "I am not." He reached into his coat and placed the ring on the table between them. It was gold with a small, deep green stone, emerald. Because the first time he had paid close attention to her eyes, he had noticed they were precisely that color. "Will you marry me, Madeline? Not because you have nowhere better to be, and not because the blizzard made the decision. Because I would like, very much, to build something with you. Something lasting. Something that is its own thing entirely, and does not belong to the past." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Her composure, that extraordinary, practiced, deeply reliable composure, made no effort at all to remain in place. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without qualification, without the careful balance of practicality that usually attended her decisions. Just yes. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it, and then she looked at him with an expression that was open and full and entirely unguarded, in the way of someone who has stopped managing themselves. He reached across the table and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her. Quietly, carefully, the way you treat something that you have been afraid of wanting and have finally allowed yourself to have. The library was warm. The afternoon light was gold through the open curtains. Somewhere in the east garden, through the window, the first of Evangeline's roses had opened. The wedding was held in May at Blackthorne Manor in the east garden itself. The roses were extraordinary, as Mrs. Warren had predicted, climbing the stone walls in every direction, white and pink and deep red, filling the air with the particular sweetness of a garden that has been properly loved. The morning was clear and still. The ceremony was small. Family, the household staff, the physicians from the Leeds wing, several relief workers Madeline had served alongside in the Eastern Territories, and Sebastian, who cried openly and without embarrassment, and was entirely unapologetic about this. Dr. Nathaniel Sterling, the family physician who had known Cyprus since childhood, and had watched the 7 years with quiet, helpless concern, stood near the back and looked at the man at the front of the assembled gathering with an expression of pure relief. Cyprus Lockwood stood in the east garden in the morning sun, and when Madeline came through the garden doors and walked down the path between the roses, he smiled. Not the small, rusty, surprised laugh of December. Not the carefully managed expression of a man managing himself. A full, genuine, unguarded smile. The kind that comes from a face that has remembered how. It was noticed by everyone present. It was the kind of thing that was impossible to miss, and impossible, once seen, to forget. Mrs. Warren pressed a handkerchief to her face. Sebastian put his arm around Edwin, who was also crying, which Edwin denied later. The ceremony was brief and true, and entirely specific to the two people involved. Cyprus held Madeline's hands and looked at her with an attention so complete that several guests felt, quietly, that they were witnessing something private. He had written his own words, not the formal ones, not the expected ones. He said, "I spent 7 years building a monument to loss and calling it faithfulness. You are the person who showed me the difference. I intend to spend the rest of my life being grateful for the blizzard." Madeline laughed, that warm, surprised, helpless laugh, and several people in the garden laughed with her. Then she said, "You knocked me into a snowbank and laughed at me." "You knocked me into the snowbank," he said, "a matter of perspective. One of many things I am willing to debate with you for the remainder of our lives." She was still laughing when he kissed her. In the months that followed, Blackthorne Manor changed. Not in the dramatic, sudden way of renovations and new furnishings, though those came too. Slowly, the protective cloths removed. The locked rooms opened, the east wing repaired, and the shutters oiled and opened to the light. The change was more fundamental. The house became warm again. The music room was open every day. The East Garden was the most discussed garden in the county by September. The winter ball was reinstated as a permanent tradition, and in its new form it included a significant charitable component that redirected a portion of the proceeds to individual practitioners in the field, which was, as Sebastian pointed out to anyone who asked, entirely Madeline's design. The accountability framework, piloted across 4 of the Foundation's charitable programs, reduced fraud rates, increased practitioner reach, and was the subject of a monograph presented to the Society for Charitable Medicine in November. Madeline presented it. Cyprus attended and sat in the front row and was observed by several of his colleagues in Parliament to be watching her with an expression that could only be described as pride. In December, exactly 1 year after the blizzard, Cyprus stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Manor and watched a new set of carriages arrive through the winter dark. Guests for the reinstated ball, arriving through clear, cold air this time. No snow, the forecourt lit with lanterns. Madeline stood beside him, a hand in his. The house was full of light and sound. The fireplaces were burning at full height. The music room door was open, and from it came the sound of someone playing. One of the housemaid's daughters, who had been showing a talent for the piano and had been given permission by the Duchess to practice in the evenings. Cyprus looked out at the arriving carriages, and he thought about 7 years of living half-heartedly in a house that had once known what warmth was. He thought about a blizzard and a stone forecourt, and the sound of something cracking, which had turned out not to be the ice. He turned to look at Madeline. She was watching the arrivals with her characteristic attention, present, interested, entirely herself. Then she felt his gaze and turned, and she looked at him with that clear, direct, unmanaged expression that had been, from the very beginning, the one thing he had not known how to protect himself against. "Are you well?" she asked. He thought about this. "Yes," he said. "Completely." She smiled, small, warm, private, entirely for him. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. Behind them, in the house, someone laughed. The music played, the candles burned, and the Duke of Blackthorne Manor, who had not smiled in 7 years, stood in the entrance hall of his home in December holding his wife's hand and felt, without performance, without management, without any of the careful mechanisms of a man protecting himself from his own experience, completely, finally, entirely alive. Love had not replaced what he lost. It had simply taught him how to live again. Thank you so much for watching till the end. If this story touched your heart, please drop a comment and tell me, do you believe love can heal someone after years of pain? And to everyone who has subscribed already, thank you. I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Please subscribe, like, and share this story with someone who loves emotional romance stories. See you in the next one.